For anyone who doesn't know me, or this is your first time here on a PAFA program, I'm Abby King, the Assistant Director of Adult Programs. And I wanted to start today's program the way I start all of our programs, which is to thank all the PAFA members on the call. I see many of you here, returning faces. So thank you all so much for being here and helping keep us PAFA strong. We appreciate so much your membership and support. If you're interested in joining, I am going to drop a link in the chat in just a moment as well.
Yeah, I do too. I think my ears
interested. So I'm going to turn things over to our speaker in just a second, but first I want to just quickly go over some Zoom etiquette things. I know for many of us, this might be our 1000th Zoom call, but it's just nice to all be on the same page. So if you've noticed, I have gone ahead and muted everyone. I'm going to ask that you stay muted for the majority of this call. While Kathy, she's going to share a presentation with all of us. We're very excited to see that. I am going to ask that you stay muted just because otherwise Zoom will assume that you're our speaker today and we'll zoom on over to you. So if you don't mind, please stay muted. But that is not to say that we don't want to hear from you. We've already got a pretty active chat. So feel free to drop questions in the chat through the whole program. We will definitely have time at the end for a Q&A where we can address some of those. Also, if you'd like to ask a question verbally at the end of the program, I know we have a ton of scholars, a lot of people who've been invited by our speaker today. We'd love to hear from you. So if you'd like, I just ask that you virtually raise your hand. So the way you do that, since we are such a big call, is if you click on the participant button at the bottom of your screen, it'll pop up on the right-hand side where it says raise hand. Otherwise, you can also just wave us down. We'll try to find you. We do definitely want to hear from you today. Other than that, I did want to mention that we are recording today's event. So all of PAFA's live Zoom programs we put on our YouTube channel to share with anyone who couldn't be here. So if you'd like to not be on the recording, feel free to silence your screen now. But also if you know someone who missed the program or if there's something, if you'd like to revisit it, I'm going to drop a link to our YouTube channel now. So our videos get uploaded within about 24 hours to 48 hours. And we have a really wonderful library of videos you can check out from this series and our other online Zoom programs as well. Other than that, I'll mention, Kathy, I might have you unmute yourself and say hi real quick so people can pin you. So since we do have such a big call.
Hello, everyone. Thanks for joining us.
For being here. So I'd recommend if you click on Catherine's square there's 3 little dots. If you drop down, there's a pin video option. So that way that you'll see her through the whole program, as well as keeping your video in speaker mode so you can see as well. But if anyone has any questions, feel free to drop them in the chat or send them to me. I'm also gonna drop my email in there as well. Yes, and we have some great backgrounds on this. Thanks, Anna, for that. So now I'd love to turn it over to our speaker. I'm just gonna give a little bit of background on her. Professor of Art History at the Graduate Center at the City University of New York, Katherine Manthorne is a specialist in American art and culture with attention to the contribution of women. To be published by the University of California Press, her book Restless Enterprise, The Art and Life of Eliza Greatorex brings back to life this feisty, remarkable figure and her extensive network of art women to shed light on the still misunderstood visual culture of the post-Civil War years. I'm so excited to now turn it over to our speaker today, and thank you so much for being here.
Thank you.
All right.
So I'll just take a second to turn on the.
Yep.
Okay, so thank you to Anna Marley and to Abby King for making my lecture possible. And thanks to all of you for joining in during your lunch hour. I'm especially pleased to be speaking to you at this moment in 2020, the centennial of the 19th Amendment to the Constitution, when women finally won the right to vote. The subject of my talk today, Eliza Greatorex, whom I'm calling the Centennial Woman, was actually involved with the women's movement, as we'll see. So for the next 40 minutes, let's transport ourselves back to the 1870s when the United States was in the throes of what was called Centennial Fever, preparing to celebrate 100 years of being an independent nation. That exhibition, officially titled the International Exhibition of Arts, Manufactures, and Products of the Soil and Mine, featured countries from Europe and the Americas. The United States, of course, showcased its industrial strength as well as its agriculture, while simultaneously looking backwards and celebrating the past. It was held in Philadelphia, of course, as most people on this program know, where PAFA, the Library Company of Philadelphia, the Philadelphia Museum of Art, and many other institutions have sponsored exhibitions and studies related to this event. So I'll be drawing on all of those. And if you just look at this map for a second, you can see, of course, it's filled, the building's filled a lot of the Fairmount Park. Here's machinery building in the main entrance building. And then you would enter, here's the women's building that we'll be talking a lot about, and also the art gallery. So the masculine presence at the fair has been discussed, of course. We are all taught that Thomas Eakins' painting of the Gross Clinic, now regarded as a city and national treasure, was rejected from the art exhibition and shown instead in this medical display, which you can see rather sad showing at the back of the room. War and heroism was tied to nationalism in works like Rothermel's Battle of Gettysburg, with a detailed study of the Pickett's Charge. And as you can see from the label, I included the size 16 by 32 feet. So this was a real crowd pleaser at the fair. But building upon the existing scholarship, my aim today is to talk to you about the women's presence there, to take a kind of tour highlighting the different contributions that they made, and in particular focusing on the little recognized roles played by these three remarkable individuals: Eliza Greatorex, whom you see here, and her two artist daughters, Kathleen and Eleanor Greatorex. So together, this trio worked not only to make the display of the women artists more robust, but also to promote it in a lot of different ways, including detailed articles that are still one of the best sources we have about the female participants. So first, just a few words to explain who is Eliza Greatorex. Probably most people don't even know how to pronounce her name, as I've discovered. So she basically lived a life that few female contemporaries could have imagined. She doubled as a kind of proper Victorian woman, whom you can see here with her gray dress and lace collar, but also a precursor to the feminists of the 1970s. She was what we would today perhaps call a single mother. She, a widow of limited financial means, she raised 4 children, including one son who went off to serve as a Union soldier in the Civil War. But at the same time that she's conducting this traditional life, she's also shaping her career, first as a landscape painter, and then as a graphic artist, to become a leading female painter of her day. She was born in 1819 in Ireland, and she lived there until she was 28. During the famine, she comes to New York and sets up herself there. And unusually for a woman, she first starts out as a landscape painter and becomes a recognized member of the Hudson River School. But as the Civil War, post-Civil War, I should say, building boom, led to the destruction of a lot of buildings around New York. They were knocking down the old buildings to make a more modern city. She started to become very alarmed by that. So she puts down her brushes and paint and teaches herself pen and ink drawings. This gave her more mobility. So as she gets news that a particular building is being knocked down, she reads in the newspaper or she hears about it, she goes to the site with her pen and ink and makes drawings of these different historic structures before they're destroyed forever. So altogether, she recorded about 80 sites. In a mark of esteem, her male colleagues elected her an associate of the National Academy of Design. And this is what I'm showing you here is her portrait. When you're elected an associate of the Academy, you either had to submit a self-portrait or a portrait. So this work was done by an artist named Boyle. And at the time that she was elected in 1869, she was the only female member at that moment. I mean, later there were more, but at the time, that was it. So I hope you read more about all her amazing ventures in my forthcoming book that Abby mentioned, Restless Enterprise. I have to do a little bit of shameless self-promotion, but for now, let's tour the Fairmount Park from the perspective of the Centennial woman. During the centennial year, the emphasis, of course, was on founding fathers and great men. In the frenzy to recover the past and celebrate the future, women were often overlooked. Yet growing numbers of women saw an opportunity to take a stand in Philadelphia. So originally the board was made up exclusively of men, but by February of 1873, after a year of work, the male board was very short of its financial goals. So in need of help with fundraising, they instituted a women's centennial committee to which they appointed 13 women, one from each of the original 13 colonies. And they, Elizabeth Duane Gillespie, whom you see here, was the granddaughter of Benjamin Franklin. She was invited to head the committee because she had done a really great job during the Civil War of working with the sanitary fair and raising a lot of money there. She accepted the appointment on the condition that when these buildings were open, there would be sufficient space for the women to display. And of course, the men promised that they would have ample space. So by the end of 1874, only a year later, Gillespie had set up centennial committees in every state, which sold stocks and Martha Washington medals, and they also held teas to raise money. So in that amount of time, she then submitted to the men a check of $100,000 for the support of the exhibition. Then she was informed that, surprise, surprise, there was no room for the women after all. So Elizabeth Gillespie, in her memoir, she writes that she never forgot, quote, the utter misery of those first moments, for the women of the whole country were working not only for patriotic motives, but with hope that through the exhibition, their own abilities would be recognized and their work would be carried beyond needle and thread. She resolved then to construct a building of their own for the exclusive display of women's work, even though they had to begin planning all over again and raise money from scratch. So when President Grant and Emperor Dom Pedro of Brazil, who are, you can't really see too well in the midst of this crowd, opened the gates to the grounds on May 10th, the Women's Pavilion miraculously was standing. Against all odds, the women had raised and erected this building in less than 11 months. So wanting to avoid what they termed men's magic, the Women's Committee invited First Lady Julia Grant and the Empress of Brazil, Teresa Cristina Marie de Bourbon, to open their building to the public just after the main opening on May 10th. It made the Philadelphia exhibition the first to showcase explicitly women's accomplishments. We never thought of employing a woman architect, Gillespie later admitted, and thus made our first great mistake. German-born Hermann Schwarzmann was only 27 years old when he was asked to design over 30 buildings at the fair. And eventually he was also asked to construct the Women's Pavilion, which, as you can see here, consisted of a wooden building 90 feet high to the cupola. And it took the form of a Greek cross with these wings extending out at the four corners. And I don't know if you can see here, but kind of gingerbread trim around the various openings and the arched roof. It was painted pale blue-gray, and it enclosed 40,000 square feet and housed 600 exhibitions, including a library and what was considered very radical at the time. They actually included a kindergarten and based a lot of their ideas on Froebel. So one of the kind of cliches of the fair, or one of the things that people know about the Women's Pavilion, is that the first sight that greeted the visitor inside the doors was the woman running the Baxter steam engine, symbol of career opportunities opening up for women. So dressed in formal attire, this woman named Emma Allison, who was an engineer, kept the apparatus running smoothly. In off moments, she was, of course, it didn't take all her energy from morning to night. So in off moments, she would lecture to the crowd and they would ask her various questions, including, of course, if she felt safe. And she explained that running the engine was far less fatiguing and far less dangerous than working over a kitchen stove. And I'm showing you here, also on the screen, the Hoe printing press, because this was a working steam engine that basically gave the energy to all the different machinery going on in the fair, including the Hoe printing press. And the Hoe printing press was where the women published their magazine called The New Century for Woman, which was the only periodical that came out weekly from the beginning of the fair on May 10th to the end of the fair on November 10th. And I should mention that the company founder, Robert Ho, was actually a very important art collector, and he actually bought works by Eliza Greatorex. So over the door to the pavilion was a modest sign that said Women's Department, and then panels on either side welcome visitors in 6 languages with the pavilion's motto. Her works do praise her in the gates, from the 31st proverb. And here's just a medal showing an abbreviated version of that phrase. So we have to just put this a little bit in the context of the women's movement at the time. Women's rights was one of the most hotly contested issues of the hour. And Gillespie and her committee had to be very careful to tread between these different constituencies. In the 19th century, idealists purposely referred to it as the woman movement. In other words, the singular was supposed to symbolize the unity of the female sex and implied that all women had one cause or one movement. But of course, as the practical Gillespie was well aware, it was probably more accurate to refer to women's movements because there were many different factions and enormous diversity in the different political positions that the women took. So for pavilion organizers didn't really want to associate with any one group. On the one hand, they wanted to sort of distance themselves from Susan B. Anthony and Elizabeth Cady Stanton, whom you see here. They were regarded as the more radical group. And actually, Susan B. Anthony didn't want anything to do with the pavilion because she said it didn't address issues of women's wages and working conditions. But Gillespie also wanted to distinguish themselves from the opposing anti-suffrage women. So to avoid taking sides, they adopted this following policy, quote, "Let every woman in the country who has ever made anything or who can make anything worth exhibiting as a credit to womanhood, send it forward in demonstration of womanly capacity outside the nursery." So amazingly, heeding this call, women worldwide submitted a wide panorama of objects, from needlework and household items to the latest inventions, including they were very interested in labor-saving devices, of course, like dishwashers. A statue carved in butter by Caroline Brooks, the so-called Butter Woman, created a minor sensation. But this was just one of many different aspects, and participation by women from Europe and Latin America was also encouraged. And here I'm just showing you a photograph of the Swedish pavilion, where you can see that the women are dressed in local attire. In the main building, European lingerie companies mounted elaborate displays to advertise the hourglass figure that could be attained with their wearing one of their garments. But in the women's pavilion, of course, there was much more concern with dress reform. And so anatomical drawings like this, you can see here displays, showed the normal body and the way in which these corsets and things completely compressed and actually moved the proper placement of the organs. So this was another cause that was being debated at the time. And I couldn't resist showing, she's a little bit earlier, but this is a Bloomer, Amelia Bloomer. And you can see that she's wearing much more sensible attire. So far, we've talked a lot about the better known features of the Women's Pavilion, but what about the fine art? How was it represented within these walls? So on a trip to Rome in 1870, Elizabeth Gillespie had visited Charlotte Cushman, whom you see here, one of the female sculptors in the circle of Charlotte Cushman. I'm sorry, I said that was Charlotte Cushman, I think. Harriet Hosmer. She was part of the circle called the White Memorial Flock around Charlotte Cushman. So Gillespie had been keen to secure the participation of Hosmer, who initially had made her reputation by sculptures like this one. You can see the puck on a toadstool. This is a wonderful example of her work that Anna Marley acquired for PAFA. And there is conflicting information about exactly what Hosmer's contribution was to the Centennial, but other women from this circle were definitely represented, so we'll get to talk about them in a minute. Some Philadelphia women, including Emily Sartain, submitted artwork to the main building, but of course that was not entirely surprising, given that her father, John Sartain, served as superintendent of the fine arts for the fair. So this is an engraving after her lost painting called The Reproof, which was the only work by a woman to earn a gold medal in the art pavilion. But at the same time, she also included some of her works on paper in the women's pavilion. So some of the women did that. They would submit some things for possible inclusion in the Memorial Hall, the main gallery, and include others in the Women's Pavilion. But the serious and worrisome gap was the art women of New York City, considered at the time the art capital of the United States. So with only a few months to go, there was little movement on their part to join the effort. Then in early March 1876, Eliza Greatorex published in the newspaper a call for united effort and invited, quote, all the working artists, women of New York, Brooklyn, and the surrounding cities to meet at her studio on East 23rd Street. So she enlisted a friend of her friend, Julia Hart Beers, whose work you see here, to help her. She also got the wife of Henry Peters Gray, who had been the former president of the National Academy, to help her network with people. And so she mobilized a substantial number, which we know all met at her studio on March 14th. So she spearheads this committee, which works tirelessly to ensure the representation of New York women at the exposition. And although she's trying to, talking to all these different people, trying to get them to submit things, at first things didn't look like they were going well at all. But finally it began to bear fruit. And so she marshaled this whole group of artists. And we read in the New York Post, quote, Mrs. Greatorex appealed to her sister artists to assure their independence and to organize an exhibition of the works which would be credible to them as a body. A committee consisting of Mrs. Greatorex, Mrs. Richmond Phillips, and Miss Mary Cook were appointed to cooperate with the New York State Centennial Art Committee in making arrangements for the display. So obviously it was a go. To finance their efforts, this was another interesting wrinkle. Greatorex initiated a fundraising exhibition, but rather than having it at one of the well-known galleries, Schauss or one of the others, she actually held it at the only female-owned gallery in the city, the Sally Gibbons Gallery. So collaborating with the Ladies Art Association, they're striving to make it a female-only effort. Once the pavilion opened, the fruits of Greatorex's labors were evident. There was work by Alice Donlevy, who had been the founder of the Ladies Art Association. And here you see Fidelia Bridges. I love this carte de visite on the left. It shows her in her attire, ready to go out into the landscape. And this is a beautiful watercolor that's in the PAFA collection by her. Greatorex must also have been the catalyst to induce Sarah Freeman Clarke to submit her work. Clarke had been a member of Margaret Fuller's circle in Boston, and later became a very good friend of Martha Mitchell, the collector Martha Mitchell, who was a joint friend of Greatorex's. So Clarke had gone on a sketching tour of Egypt and created works like this image here. You can see it's a triptych, the doors close, and this is what it looks like on the other side. So the press is noticing Clarke's work in the exhibition. It says, Miss Clarke, from her studio in Rome, sends a powerful picture of the Temple of Eshna on the Nile. You must look for this. So, occasionally the women were noticed. So we begin to see that, in fact, this exhibition is shaping up better than it had been before Greatorex got involved. So then we have to ask ourselves, why Greatorex? Why is she the one to organize the female artists? Who, in other words, put her in charge? So the more I worked on this woman, the more I realized that really no one would have had to have put her in charge. She was the self-appointed leader. She took the initiative when she saw the little movement on the part of her cohort to be represented in this great national display. And just from her own experiences, her husband had died in the 50s, and she didn't leave her with much money or property or anything. Her own art career was basically helping to support herself and her 4 children. So she sees art, she sees these different professional opportunities featured at the fair as a way to convince the world that women can support themselves and their families. The journalist Lucy Holbrook described Eliza in 1876 as, quote, a sweet-faced woman of between 50 and 60 years of age, with hair white and curling loosely about her head, slender form and thoughtful, earnest manner. So this image on the upper right is the one that illustrated the comments that Holbrook made. And you can see she hasn't changed too much from 1869 when we saw that earlier picture of her. But certainly by now, she must be very relieved when the exhibition opens and some of her labors are at an end. So here you can see the official art exhibition was organized in Memorial Hall, where Greatorex, like the other figures I mentioned, including Sartain, showed some works here and some works in the women's pavilion. So she says, with her daughter says, with a few sketches, she sustained the position that was always granted her by her brother artists. And this is one of 18 of her pen and ink drawings that were shown in the Memorial Hall. And eventually it becomes part of this whole portfolio, Old New York from the Battery to Bloomingdale. But if any of you have ever done much research on the Centennial Exhibition, you know that it's a bit confusing to determine exactly what works were exhibited there and what weren't. Sometimes a work was sent in after they already made the catalog. Sometimes they made the catalog thinking a work was there and it wasn't. So you can't just depend on the catalog. So in this case, the drawing that I just showed you actually bears the sticker on the back showing that it was included in the International Exhibition, the state and the New York State board. So that's just one interesting aspect of the research. So here you can see this is a rare photograph. This is half of a stereograph of the Women's Pavilion. So just imagine yourselves now walking into this space and what is it that we encounter here? So the official policy had dictated an open and democratic arrangement with domestic objects shown side by side with the handiwork of much more recognized figures from around the globe. So look around a minute. Where's the art gallery? As the works began to arrive in Philadelphia, the women realized that the architect had failed to include a proper space for an art gallery. The art gallery in the Women's Pavilion, said a visitor, there's no such thing. There are alcoves to hang pictures in, but you can't call those spaces with murderous cross lights a gallery in any sense. The art gallery in the Women's Building was an afterthought, Eleanor Greatorex wrote regretfully. The spirit which has introduced so many women to send their pictures to these alcoves as an art exhibition of progress reached thus far is deserving of high praise. And again, you're looking at a kind of rare artist rendering of the crowds that are passing through the space. And you can get a little bit of an idea here of the way they sort of use some of these room dividers to make alcoves. But as visitors said here, even popular pictures by male artists would have been at a disadvantage. Take the Laytons and the Boughtons from Memorial Hall and hang them here, Eleanor challenged, and see how they would be slaughtered. So obviously there's a lot of gender politics going on. But even in the midst of all this, Greatorex managed to command a separate space of her own. I mean, just imagine at this fair, there are many huge buildings and a profusion of displays in each one, all competing for their visitors' attention. There are huge crowds, intense heat that summer, and great distances to be covered on foot. So it's a miracle that anybody got any attention or, that the public could figure out anything they wanted to really look at. And yet, Greatorex rated an illustration in this nationally syndicated magazine. So I don't know if you can see too well, but at the bottom, the caption on this engraving is telling. It's number 1 is crayon drawings, so pretty broad heading. Number 2, statuary, sufficed for most of what was pictured here. But the journal special artist took the trouble to delineate Greatorex's work. And number 3 is Mrs. Greatorex's pen and ink drawings. So again, I take that as an indication that there was interest in her work and a certain respect to call out her specific contribution. So what is it that she showed here? So for the previous 10 years, she had been engaged in an enormous venture to record New York's old churches and homes, many captured as they were being destroyed in the name of progress. So first she had done more traditional type painting. So here you can see this house, the Chaudelet house, is about to be destroyed, and she's doing a more traditional landscape painting. But then as the pace of destruction increases and she needs a more responsive medium, as I said before, she starts using pen and ink. So when a structure was slated for demolition, she grabs her quill pen and her paper and ink and rushes to draw it for posterity, especially homes and churches. And this is actually the Jumel Mansion, which is, thank goodness, still standing, one of the ones that was not actually destroyed at the time. So then her sister, Matilda Pratt Despard, she joins forces with her sister and she writes text about each of these houses. So they interview the people who are still living there. They do research at the New York Historical Society and in other books, and they begin to create a narrative that accompanies these different images. So then once she had all the pen and ink drawings, probably over 100, she had them all duplicated as heliotypes by a mechanical reproduction method. And this is one example that you see here. She then assembles it into a book, and you can see it's a large 14 by 11 that was also on display in the exhibition. And so you get the sense of the title, Old New York, from the Battery to Bloomingdale, that she's literally trying to cover the whole island of Manhattan. And then just imagine, again, she would have had all these things on display in the Centennial, opening this book, and you can see that the text about the building is on one side, and she has the illustrations tipped in on the other side. So this is the kind of the format of the book. And then another thing that she did is that when she went to the sites as the buildings were being torn down, she would take some of the panels from the different buildings, sometimes from the pulpit, sometimes from the outside of the building. You know, sometimes there was very fine wood that was used in the interior, and she took some of that, other times not. But this is one example when she actually drew the likeness of the North Dutch Church, painted on a panel from the pulpit, and then her daughter, Eleanor, does some of the decorative work. So these are just blow-ups of that, and then I'll just show you. So you can see that, I won't bother to read the whole inscription, but you can see her outrage. Built in 1767, demolished in 1875. So she has this frustration about New York and its, you know, lack of concern with its own history. It's tearing down these buildings and not really preserving any of this. So she's trying to at least preserve it in her own work. And then another interesting thing she did is that she realized that, you know, she didn't get to New York until 1850. She didn't start this project till later. So there were a lot of buildings that she wasn't actually able to capture. They were already gone by the time she was on the scene. So she began to collect the work of Archibald Robertson. And I don't know if that name is familiar to most of you. It probably is to a lot, but he came from Scotland to New York and started one of the first art academies in New York City. And he also did some of these antiquarian drawings. So she also curated a section in the Centennial of Robertson's work adjacent to her own. So you can imagine that's the first and only time in her career she's able to stage this whole New York project as she meant to be seen, this totality of all these different, the books, the prints, the paintings, of the kind of Gesamtkunstwerk, if you will, that German term for the total work of art. So the summation of all these works that she worked, that developed this cherished theme of hers, that is to recapture a lost past. And this, of course, was one of the themes of the Centennial. So that was one of the reasons that she was rushing to get this big magisterial book into production by the time of the Centennial, is so that her hope was, of course, that people would buy it. The mother's work was buttressed by the accomplishments of her two daughters. Already admired as a rising star of the next generation, Kathleen hinted at things to come. And I'm cheating a little bit. This one wasn't in the Centennial, but the corn was in the Centennial. So you get a sense of her kind of more sophisticated handling of paint than her mother, and much more decorative sense. The younger sister, Eleanor, adopted the role of historian. She carefully observed all that she could pertaining to the women artists and authored a series of articles week after week in the New Century for Women. She did articles on Swedish artists, British artists. She also talked about how women can get an art education, different opportunities for women. So between the three of them, they're kind of instrumental in raising the professional profile of the women's pavilion. Some women rejected what they regarded as the segregated realm of the women's pavilion and competed against the men to secure a place in the sprawling fine arts department. And here you see an image of Memorial Hall. And some of you probably know this is the only building still standing on the Fairmount Park grounds. And this is now the Please Touch Museum that you see here. But imagine now we're going inside. And this is one artist's interpretation anyway of the kinds of crowds and the works that you would have seen in there. There were vast numbers of paintings, more than 500 sculptures from all over the Western world, including about 150 by Americans, a handful of which were women. So you had to submit your work to a jury to be in Memorial Hall. Competition was stiff, and it was by no means sure that you would be admitted. Lily Martin Spencer had been a pioneering figure for women since the 1850s. And she first won acclaim with her kitchen scenes. Here you can see she's sort of saying shake hands, joking with her hand all covered with material that she's using for cooking. But by the time of the Centennial, the work on the right is what she was doing by then. So she's present in the exhibition. We then, I don't know if the name Vinnie Ream is familiar to all of you, but she gained notoriety when, just still a young teenager, she was commissioned to create the life-size statue of Abraham Lincoln for the Capitol in Washington. So by 1876, she gambled that she could gain admission to the Memorial Hall. And in this case, it paid off. She included a number of male busts, portrait busts, and also these two works that you can see, the West and the Spirit of Carnival. Another female sculptor who submitted her work on speculation was Mary Edmonia Lewis, of mixed African-American and Native American descent. She had labored 4 years in Rome on the life-size figure of the death of Cleopatra. And here, instead of the usual discussion of her work, I would like to read a personal anecdote that was recounted in the New York Times, because I think it gives you an idea of the experiences that people had with this selection committee. So this is from the Times. Quote, "She tells the story of the reception of her work at Philadelphia with curious frankness. She was lingering about within earshot of the committee room when her statue was brought out and opened. She had seen work after work rejected by the committee, which left her trembling over the fate of her own work. At length, the box containing the dying Cleopatra was brought out and opened. I scarcely breathed," she said. "I felt as if I was nothing. They opened the box, looked at the work, talked together for a moment, and then I heard the order given to place it in such and such a position. The Indian stoicism gave way. Miss Lewis swallowed her sobs for the moment and went home and had a good cry all by herself." So, I mean, if many of you are familiar with the kinds of reviews that appear in the press at the time, there's always a little bit of an edge, something that has to put the women sort of in, express something about the fact that they were emotional, or some little put down. So the idea that she had to go home and have a good cry was a little bit of that type of thing. But in any case, it was installed in Gallery K, and there it stirred up a great deal of controversy. But I just want to pause for a minute and mention the minimal participation of African Americans at the Centennial. There was no official policy barring them from the grounds, but they were hardly welcome either. It was true that Frederick Douglass had been invited to be on the opening committee. He's sitting on the stage with Ulysses S. Grant and others. But in fact, Philadelphia police had actually stopped him and tried to refuse him admission before someone assured them of who he was. And here I just want to show you, this is one of the few images revealing the presence of African Americans surrounding this statue by Francesco Pezzicara, an Italian sculptor called The Free Slave. And you can see, you know, well-dressed, respectable crowds here in this image, but that was very rare. We don't have too many examples of things, many images showing their presence. Other American women sculptors depicted Cleopatra, including Margaret Foley, whom you see here. She exhibited this bust at the Centennial, but it was really Edmonia Lewis's depiction of female death that repelled, but also fascinated the crowd. There was a lot of discussion about this work. And it seemed that, again, there was a kind of underlying symbolism, perhaps. Death provided Cleopatra's escape from Octavius. I don't know if you can see too well, but she commits suicide with by being bitten by the snake. And so she escapes the intentions of these men to show her off as the spoils of war. So Cleopatra's death was interpreted in this post-Civil War era as a symbol of emancipation. Anyway, oops, sorry. Beginning in 1848, oh, sorry, what's going on here? Sorry, I don't know what's happened. Beginning in 1848, women co-joined their battle for equal rights with Black emancipation and worked hard for abolition. After emancipation and the war, serious social change looked possible. Suffragists and visual artists were justifiably expectant that their time had come. Then in May 1870, the 15th Amendment to the Constitution was ratified, stating that the vote could not be held based on, quote, race, color, or previous condition of servitude. So again, the women were entirely excluded from the right to vote. So that happened in 1870. By 1876, at the Centennial, they again see the opportunity to further their struggle. So the 4th of July celebration is what I'm showing you here, was the kind of crescendo of the whole Centennial, of course. There were all kinds of different events that went on. They were dedicating fountains and statues, and they had fireworks. But one of the big deals was that what you're seeing here, that Richard Lee, who was the grandson of Robert E. Lee, read from the original Declaration of Independence. The woman had applied to also be part of this ceremony, but their suggestions, they had been denied the right to do that. So they decided that they would take that occasion, and they took their Declaration of the Rights of the Women of the United States. And when Mr. Lee finished reading this, they marched up to the platform with this declaration, giving out various flyers and things as they went, and trying to get a little bit of attention for their cause. They then returned to their seats, and following this event, Anthony left the grounds of the fair and went to Independence Hall, where she again spoke. She said, that they wanted a trial by jury of one's peers, which should include women. There should be no taxation without representation. And they wanted the word male removed from state constitutions. And she concludes with these words: "We ask of our rulers at this hour no special favors, no special privileges, no special legislation. We ask justice, we ask liberty. We ask that all civil and political rights that belong to citizens of the United States be guaranteed to us and our daughters." So we don't know if Greatorex actually attended one or both of these events, but we do know that she was friends with Susan B. Anthony, and she was also friendly with a British suffragist called Emily Faithfull. So it's very likely that she could have been there. So during the 100th anniversary of American independence, of course, the founding fathers were much celebrated, and none more than Washington. New books were written about him, poems were recited, songs were sung. There were all kinds of things that were displayed there, including, as you can see here, this is a photo of the relics of George Washington, including his uniform, his breeches. And this is, I'm just showing you, this is the one, as far as I know, the one surviving uniform of George Washington, which is in the Smithsonian. So people talked about this as, almost like the relics of a saint that are being exhibited here. So amidst all this Washington mania, Greatorex began to conceive a new proto-feminist project. With her daughter, Eleanor, she heads to Washington, D.C. and to Mount Vernon, which had been acquired in 1859 by the Mount Vernon Ladies Association. And they had restored it and were beginning to establish it as a tourist destination. So Eliza and Eleanor take the boat up the Potomac to Mount Vernon, and there they're sketching all day long. Then an extraordinary thing happened by evening. All the visitors filed back on the boat, but the Greatorex women remained, having been granted the extraordinary privilege to stay overnight in Martha Washington's bedroom. So here on the left, you can see, these are the sketches that Eleanor Greatorex made, the room in which Martha Washington died, the hallway leading up to Martha Washington's room. So this then became the cover of a portfolio. This is one of the mother's works here. They do a whole portfolio, which they go back to the Centennial and print and sell. So again, this idea that they're capturing the spirit not of the great hero of the American Revolution, but of the first Lady, Martha Custis Washington. So some dismissed the Women's Pavilion as eclectic. Some other people said that it was too much of a mix of amateurs and professionals, but many found it very stimulating. And here I'm just showing you one example. This is Candace Wheeler's calling as America's first woman textile and interior designer. She said was born here. She was 49 years old when she visited the fair. She was a wife, a mother, and just an amateur flower painter. But in her memoir, she later recalled that going to the exhibition, the Centennial, and seeing the embroideries of the London's Royal School of Needlework literally changed her life. Inspired by the school's objective to teach women to create professional quality needlework as a means of financial support, she then went home and in 1877 found the Society of Decorative Artists. The next year, she helped launch the New York Exchange for Women's Work, where they could sell any homemade goods. And then, as many of you probably know, she also became a partner of Lewis Comfort Tiffany before she founded her own firm. So Greatorex must have taken great comfort in Wheeler's evolution, for it fulfilled the Pavilion's goal to demonstrate career opportunities for women. So as Wheeler, Greatorex, and their sisterhood gained recognition, they demonstrated that women could in fact function in the public arena, and this was a very important aspect. So just to round out, we're getting to the end of the fair. November 7th was declared Women's Day at the Centennial. The female of the species had Fairmount Park to themselves. And here you can see, I'm just showing you again another shot that gives you a little bit of an idea of the vast spaces that were open here. The press estimated the number of attendees just to the Women's Pavilion alone was about 74,000. So to the uninformed, it might seem like a privilege. Wow, you know, the women have the place to themselves. They can get a closer look at the displays because everything was closing for good on November 10th. But what day was this? For many women, this was a bitter reminder. For November 7th was election day, when beyond the confines of Fairmount Park, the business of electing a president was being conducted. So this just underscored the fact that the women were denied the right to vote. And of course, this was a hotly contested election, and I'm just showing you Rutherford, Hayes, and Tilden. You know, the decision went on forever, and some people still debate what really happened in that election. You wonder what would have happened if the women had been voting that year. So to conclude then, the women had labored long and hard on the premise of a new openness in American society. That promise suffered severe setbacks in the 1870s, but as we know, its advocates would continue fighting until 1920, when some of the women attending the Centennial would actually live to cast their votes. And I like to think that Kathleen, who did live past this time, might have cast her vote. But I'm especially pleased then to speak to you today because if you think about it, the precise date of this anniversary is August 18th, 1920. So that anniversary is 6 days away, an excellent reason to celebrate all these women. And my lecture also anticipates an exhibition entitled Women in Motion, curated by Anna Marley, that will open in early 2021. So this is really a moment when I have great hope that a lot more of the 19th century women and their issues are going to become more visible. So I thank you for your kind attention.
Thank you so much. That was wonderful. Thanks everyone. So we do have some time for questions. I want to reiterate for anyone who missed it at the beginning, feel free to put questions in the chat and we are here to answer them. Or if you'd like to ask your question verbally, if you could just raise your hand virtually by clicking the participant button where it says raise hand, or just wave at us and unmute yourself. That's totally fine.
Should we start here?
Some amazing things in the chat. Some great feedback.
Do you think it's better to stop the screen share now?
Yes, please. That would be wonderful. It's nice to see everyone since we've got such a big call today. Okay, we've got Anna. Anna, go for it. Of course. PAFA Zone.
Hi, Kathy. Thank you so much. That was wonderful.
Thank you.
So my question, I really love the shout out about all the women, and I'm looking forward to more questions and hearing about that. But I was fascinated about the connection between Brazil and the United States, and the fact that Grant and Dom Pedro opened the fair, and that you told us about the women's building too. And I don't think that that's something many people know about, and I happen to know you have a lot of expertise on Latin American, South America, U.S. relations. So I wonder if you could talk a little bit about that.
Oh, of course, yeah. Well, originally I had included more detail about that, but obviously time is an issue. But when the United States was organizing the fair, they invited a number of different dignitaries from different countries, and certainly Brazil being, some people don't even realize Brazil is as large a country as the United States. And so they were very keen to have a strong, Brazil was very keen to have a strong presence at the fair. They wanted to show off their own industrial strength. And so Dom Pedro and his wife came to the United States, one of the very few foreign leaders who actually spent that much time there. He stayed the entire 6 months in Philadelphia, and you can find all kinds of diaries of people like running into Dom Pedro of course, they don't understand, he's an emperor and they just call him Dom. They think that's his first name or something. It's kind of funny. But anyway, so they, they're all talking about how he doesn't seem like, he's such an engaging person. And it's kind of a pity that his country still has slavery, but he's so charming that they're forgiving that. And so there are lots of interesting things. And then after the fair, he actually takes the Transcontinental Railroad out to California, because he's very interested in industrializing Brazil further, and he was a big proponent of the railroad in Brazil, so he wants to study all this. But apropos PAFA, I think I told you this, but at the fair I mentioned that Schwarzman built a lot of the pavilions, but Dom Pedro was smart enough, and the Brazilian contingent was smart enough, they actually hired Frank Furness, who was a much more up-and-coming architect and made a much more interesting pavilion for Brazil. So they had a lot of important presence there. So it was kind of a moment of the, and then also you have to remember that there was a lot going on with coffee trade, especially the coffee trade. So the United States was the biggest consumer of Brazilian coffee at the time. So the Brazilian Exposition had, besides art, they also had coffee and other things. So it was a really interesting kind of coming together of the countries.
Thanks, Kathy.
And thanks, Anna, for that question. So we've got a lot of wonderful questions already in the chat. I wanted to start with one from Amanda, asking if there was a debate among women as to whether they should submit to the Fine Arts Department or to the Women's Building in the Centennial. So as you said, that some appeared in both.
Yeah, I mean, it was a challenge because, being in the Women's Pavilion was more of a sure thing, shall we say? I mean, there wasn't the same kind of jury judging them, but just like there was such a range of attitudes about women's rights. I mean, we all think, oh, they must have all wanted to vote. Well, a lot of them didn't want to vote. They wrote, some of the women wrote whole treatises about how women shouldn't be voting. So, we have a certain idea that they must have all thought the same way, and they didn't. So some desperately wanted to be associated with their fellow women, like Greatorex, for example. Her daughter says, she shows with beginners to encourage them. She wanted to show with some of these more younger artists and younger artisans, if you want to call them that. And then other people were desperate to make a name for themselves in the in the main art gallery. And the United States had never done anything like this before either, really. I mean, they had participated in Paris, but they never hosted their own fair. So the whole organization, the whole aspect of the organization was kind of up for grabs too. They were making it up as they went along. So it was, yeah, but definitely the women were talking about what to do about this. And some just figured, oh, why bother? And there were also competitions between Philadelphia, was chosen pretty early on as the city to host the fair. And then New Yorkers felt like that was a big city, important financial center. And so some people thought there was a competition there. So they actually, in New York, mounted some of their own exhibitions. So there's just like so many different little infighting going on.
Sounds like lots of different contingencies there.
Nothing ever changes, right? No one can agree.
Yeah, that definitely hasn't changed. Before this, just because it's a little bit of a callback to Anna's question, I wanted to ask Aaron, since we're talking about Brazil, he asked if coffee was sold at the expo and if it was any good.
Oh, yeah, that's a good question. Yeah. It was sold there. I mean, there were so many things that were, it was, I think I mentioned it was one of the hottest summers in years there. So at first the fair maker, the people who organized it said no beer, no drinking of any kind. And then it was so hot that they said, okay, yeah, you can have beer. And then Heinz root beer introduced their root beer there. Bananas were introduced there, but coffee was definitely served. But I think from the descriptions, one of my students is working on this, but from the descriptions, coffee in the 1870s would not have been anything like what we think of as coffee today. It was very bitter, and it was very different than with our fine Starbucks and all of that. But definitely it was served there. Tea was also, there were the pavilions from some of the foreign countries like Ceylon and others. They would have they featured tea.
Yeah, so no frappuccinos, but definitely coffee. I wanted to ask Julia's question, and Anna, this might also be to you, but a little bit, if we could talk about the exhibition that Kathy so nicely plugged for us, and then also the question about where Greatorex's primary work, or where their work is primarily held today. So either one of those.
Well, Anna Marley should talk about her own exhibition because I don't know as much about it as, you know, I've heard bits and pieces, but she would be the one to speak to that. But just in terms of where Greatorex's work are, they are, a lot of the works on paper, the prints and the books are in the Library of Congress. The Museum of the City of New York has a large cache of all her original drawings for the old New York. She had been, well, the Clark family that now, you know, that established the Clark Museum in Williamstown had been patrons of hers. So they bought a huge cache of her drawings and then later gave it to the Museum of the City of New York. The Met has a lot, but the paintings are mostly in private hands. I showed two that were in the collection of Ronald Berg. He has a website, and sadly, some of them are have still not been located. So I'm praying that when the book comes out, maybe some of them will come out of the woodwork.
And I can briefly answer the question about the exhibition. So, sorry. Okay, Kate. Yeah. It should be opening in the spring of 21, late winter, early spring 21. It will include about 90 works of women artists who are somehow associated with PAFA from the Peels in the 18 teens up until the 1940s. So we're really excited and working on a catalog right now that will be published in conjunction with the book. And I think for those of you who were excited to learn about Greatorex, you're going to learn about a lot of other wonderful women who you may never have heard of, along with famous women you might know, like Cecilia Bow and Mary Cassatt and Georgia O'Keeffe, but artists like Elizabeth Sparhawk Jones, Annie Trick-Hair Lang, Hilda Belker, really great artists who you might not know about, who are really talented. So including Emily Sartine, who Katherine mentioned.
Thanks, Anna. I'll also drop a link. You gave a wonderful event it feels like many moons ago, but where you talked about some of the amazing women in our collection that will be featured. So I'll drop a link to that in just a second too, for anybody who might have missed that for our first program. So thank you to you both. So we have a question from Jay that was asking what the controversy over the exhibition of Dying Cleopatra was, and if there was any effort made by the Works Selection Committee to include works by women of color.
Okay, so I'll start with the second question first. There seemed to be almost no effort to include people of color, men or women. In fact, I didn't mention, but there was a famous incident of an artist named Edward Bannister who submitted his work to the exhibition and ended up being selected to win a prize by the committee. And when the committee found out that he was a person of color, they tried to withdraw the prize from him and give it to someone else, but all the other artists, his fellow artists, protested so much that they ended up, you know, giving the prize to Bannister after all. So that was kind of a black mark on the committee. But certainly there was no particular effort to include women of color. But the controversy over the Cleopatra was the whole idea of, first of all, a dying woman, because you saw the image I showed by Foley of just a proper kind of, you know, bust with her emotions in total control. But in the case of Edmonia Lewis's Cleopatra, she's showing her herself when she just showed her. The sculptor is showing Cleopatra just at the moment when she is passing away, having killed herself. So that was part of the controversy, just this idea that, you know, people were talking about, oh, go find the sculpture where the dying woman is being shown. And so it was, you know, it was kind of it stood out among the very stoic looking images.
Thank you. So we have time for just one more. We're reaching the end of our program. But I wanted to make sure to ask this because we had a question about this earlier, and selfishly, I was also really curious about this too, about the butter sculpture. So Marie asked if the Carolyn Brooks butter sculpture was a special commission made by the exhibition or if it was considered a piece of art that was selected. And I believe the first question, it's really far back in the chat, but was about, so correct me if I'm wrong, person who asked it, but it was about asking if this was, you know, one of the first butter sculptures or what made it unusual or something to see, since you mentioned that.
Well, like, this woman was known for doing that before the Centennial. But I think that's part of the amazing thing that she achieved was that, you know, sculpting it and keeping it sort of intact in the summer heat and all that, and being able to do that for the Centennial. But it had a whole history. Butter sculpting had a whole history, which was started out more from the culinary side. You know, like wealthy people in the 18th century or something would have these butter sculptures put in the middle of their tables when they had parties or things like that. So there was a tradition of that was more a domestic and culinary art, and this woman carries it over, and, you know, using, of course, figures from antiquity and literary figures and things like that as her subjects. It becomes, you know, sort of, again, another kind of controversial thing that stood out from a lot of what else was going on there.
I'm the one that asked the question about the butter sculpture, and I just wanted to clarify, do you know if that particular butter sculpture was commissioned by the exposition, or was it just selected as a piece of artwork to be exhibited?
No, I mean, all the women, nothing in the women's pavilion, as far as I know, is specifically commissioned.
Okay.
She would have submitted it as the work that she wanted to represent her.
Oh, okay. All right.
Yeah.
I'm just asking because my husband and I do butter sculptures, and
Really?
so it's always a commission. We have, yeah, it's never been.
And also, you know, some of the works I showed were the stereographs that were made as souvenirs of the fair. So clearly, the fact that, you know, an image was made, that stereograph that I showed was made of it, shows that, you know, it was something that people wanted to collect and show at home when they got home.
Thank you.
That's fantastic. Thanks so much, Marie, for sharing. If you have a link, please feel free to drop it in the chat. I'm sure everyone here would love to see
Yeah, that'd be fun.
more butter sculptures. This is such a lovely way to end today's program. So I wanted to thank all of you for being here. And of course, thank you, Katherine Manthorne, for sharing your scholarship with our audience. It's been wonderful and enlightening. So
Thank you so much.
all of you again. I dropped a link to Kathy's book. Please check that out, as well as future events. And Kathy, I'll let you say the last word. Sorry.
Well, I guess, what should we say? Don't forget to vote in November.
Vote for women. We can vote for a woman.
Yes, that's right. Finally, we have.
Thank you, Kathy, so much. And thank you, everybody who joined in. I see friends from all over the country. This is so wonderful, such a wonderful way to stay connected. Thanks a lot.
Bye-bye.
Yeah, thank you.
Feel free to unmute yourself and say goodbye on the way out. We'd love to hear from you. Take care, everybody. Next time.
Thanks. Bye. Thank you.
Bye.
Bye. Bye.